a panel of discussion. We're very privileged this morning to have good experts from industry who are going to talk through our questions today, principally focusing on productivity in project delivery. So if I just welcome the panel to the stage, and we'll get started, please. Yeah, got 5 seats. Good morning again and welcome. Morning. Morning. Now, it's what's mentioned that we all know that infrastructure is very key to economic productivity. Elliot has mentioned a few of that. And as industry experts, industry partners as well, that is very key. Now, this is why it's very important that as industry, from a supply chain, from a client perspective, we get productivity right. If that's going to be driving economic growth. So our questions this morning will look at exactly that, and I'm keen to also hear from the audience as well after the initial discussions and questions. So we'll have an engaging discussion on what the challenges are, what the barriers are, and also how we can drive some of this productivity in project delivery. So if I start by introducing our panel members, just tell us who you are and what role you play in the industry before we go through the questions. David.
Thank you, Os, and thank you for the opportunity. So my name is David Porter. I'm the Director of Engineering in the Department for Infrastructure in Northern Ireland, so that makes me the Chief Highway Engineer for Northern Ireland. And I'm also the Senior Vice President of the Institution of Civil Engineers, which will mean that come November I will be the President of ICE.
Thank you, David. James.
Yeah, good morning all. So my name is James Birch. I'm the Managing Director at Highways within Kier Transportation. So I'm responsible for our portfolio of maintenance contracts and also major road projects.
Thank you, James. Laura?
Morning everyone, Laura Wilkinson. I'm the Project Delivery Practice Director for Highways and Local Transport at AtkinsRéalis. So responsible for delivery of our key strategic highways projects.
Thanks, Laura. Ben?
Good morning all. Yeah, Ben Hodgkin. I head up the major programs team at ABP, so Associated British Ports. I'm a maritime civil engineer by training, sort of designed, master planned, delivered port infrastructure for the last 20 years. So yeah, very happy to be here giving the port view.
Thank you very much. And we've listened to Elliot previously. So I've got a question which I'm going to throw through the panel currently. And if you could please just talk through your perspective, either a supplier or client perspective. And it's simply, what are some of the key challenges and barriers faced in your experience of delivery of infrastructure projects? And there's a second part to it. It's simply what can be done to drive these efficiencies, improvements as well, and productivity that the industry requires. So if we start with you, David, from a client perspective, a public sector client perspective.
Yeah, thank you. So I think in terms of actually the delivery of projects, I think it's worth taking a step back and thinking about our strategic approaches, because by having a strategic approach, to know where you're going overall, to have that direction, that then allows the political changes that we have and the individual challenges that Elliot outlined in terms of budget and finance to be better managed. And the reason why I say that is because I've now worked in the department for 26 years, and I can remember as a very young graduate sitting listening to a presentation about the strategic road network in Northern Ireland and how the road network was going to support the regional development strategy, how Northern Ireland was going to develop, where the development was going to happen, where the economic activity was, where the houses were going to be built, how it connected then with the Republic of Ireland and its connections across to the rest of the UK. And it set out the key transport corridors, and it defined those, not in terms of the individual projects that we were going to deliver, but actually the importance of those routes. And for the next 26 years of my career, I've delivered projects to that plan. And as politicians changed, and as we had different priorities within the department and within government, and also whenever we had constraint on budget, that overall plan didn't actually change. So that strategic direction was clear, what the roads that we need to do, and therefore the pipeline and the disruption that individual ministers and decisions and the change in the world economy made actually didn't derail the overall plan. It just changed it slightly, or it allowed that context. So having that strategic direction, that vision of where we need to go strategically, I think it's hugely important.
Thank you very much. I think that's some benefit we get from devolved administration. Yeah. James, from a supplier perspective, in your case, highway, how do you address that question?
Yeah, so I think before I come on to sort of the barriers and potential solutions around the barriers, I just want to sort of take a step back and go back to Elliot's, probably the first slide, something you said around it is hard to deliver. Well, it has been hard to deliver, but I think we have delivered to a point. We could deliver better, and that's the point of us being here today. But if we go back to the first slide about all the things that the strategic road network enables us to do, without being able to deliver and implement projects and maintain road networks and undertake renewals, we wouldn't be able to provide that evidence that we do. However, in terms of sort of the barriers, for me there's still a big thing, and you touched on around that strategic direction, there's still a big thing around certainty and consistency, or lack of a detailed and mature pipeline. Because we do see projects move to the right, we see things change, and that's going to happen to an extent. But if we look at the barriers around, I've got two main things, so consistency of pipeline and people. Now, people in themselves aren't a barrier, but the lack of consistency around the pipeline enhances or makes that a barrier. So we need to have a better understanding of the long-term vision of what is going to be delivered and when it's going to be delivered, and having some certainty around when projects are going to start and what they're going to look like, and the timeframes for sort of through design, through DCO, through delivery, gives that certainty to the supply chain that we can invest in people. Now, people are our biggest asset, but I think for me, the utilisation of people is probably one of our biggest risks. So all too often will we put a team together to deliver a project. That team will invest in and will get ready to deliver a project. And for a number of reasons, macro and microeconomical, valid and sometimes challenging, that project will move, or it will shift to the right. We then have a risk that what do we do with those people? How do we retain those people? And where can we put those people until that project starts? So for me, there's the key barriers. It's that consistency around a mature pipeline of what are we going to do and when are we going to do it, and is it going to change? And if it is going to change, how do we mitigate that? And then ensuring we can build those teams to deliver those projects successfully.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting. Laura, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, similar to other views, the strategy is fundamental, and that pipeline visibility. But equally, it's how we build diverse teams, how we grow, how we include that efficiency. And efficiency can mean so much. So I think it's a little bit about stepping back and unpicking that, how we build climate resilience in, how we use data better and more wisely, and how we build other aspects like social value, and not have them as an expensive bolt-on, but something that adds value, adds efficiency as we go along. So I think they're challenges that are, the positive challenges where we can really make a difference.
Thank you very much. Ben, from a port's perspective,
yeah,
very private sector driven as well. What's your take on this?
And that's, when I was thinking about this, I think that's sort of key to understand, just to set the sort of context. So ABP are a private company, so we are owned by shareholders, a mixture of pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and so the key challenge, the sort of the primary challenge for us when we think about project delivery is, do we have a project? And when I mean that, do we have a bankable business case that we can take forward? And so that's sort of number one for us. And how do we get over that first hurdle? And that is, in our traditional, what you typically think of the role of a port in terms of handling goods and trade, that was reasonably straightforward because we'd have a long-term deal with a customer and we'd be able to sort of work through that process. But recently that's become slightly more challenging because we're having a much bigger role in enabling the energy transition, and that's sort of the second of our twin missions. And that means that we are playing in a space that is much less developed. We're working with customers who are looking at new technology, new commercial models for sustainable aviation fuel, hydrogen, CO2, carbon capture and storage, floating offshore wind, new markets that haven't existed anymore. before. So a real key challenge for us is how we make sure we're working with government to make sure that our customers have the support, the policy support and financial support where necessary to sort of enable these emerging sectors. And I think that for us is primarily becoming more of an issue than it has done in the past. And it's something that we need to overcome before we even get to delivery. So for me, it's about how we get over that first hurdle.
Thank you very much. Elliot.
Yeah, no, actually I was going to reflect. I think the challenge I talked about are at a similar phase in the process, but from a slightly different perspective. So if I look back at the last 5 years, I think the biggest challenge in project delivery for us have been around the planning process and the legal process, actually. So, we found increasingly sort of planning has taken longer and longer to get through and has been more onerous. And then, there's been sort of successive legal challenges. So for some of our projects, that you can sort of challenge them 3 times. Each of those challenges tends to take about 18 months to deliver. So, one of our projects, for example, we've got a DCO. It's been challenged sort of 3 times, so it's taken 4.5 years to get through the legal challenges. All of them have been dismissed at every point, but your DCO only lasts for 5 years. So all of a sudden you've just got this tiny little window in which you need to kind of make sure you've delivered and then, basically kind of gone through all the legal issues and then crack on. So I do think I'm very supportive of what the government is trying to do in terms of sort of planning reform and sort of reform that. I think for all of us delivering infrastructure, that is kind of critical and helpful because we need to create a more enabling environment really in which we can deliver. And I do think, I kind of recognise the points about a bit more stability within that, and I do hope, certainly from a public sector perspective, once we get through the likes of the spending review, etc., it provides that bit more stable sort of platform. Equally, I do think there's a kind of question, what's that right balance of stability versus agility? Because I do think, priorities are going to change, things are going to shift. And, how as an industry do we get that right agility to respond? I think that's probably quite a big challenge for all of us as well.
Thank you very much. And if I may come back to you, David, you did mention just now about a strategic plan. In your case, 26 years ago, and you've delivered it until now. It would be good to have that level of certainty and clarity over the years. We don't have much of that these days. But if I ask a question on that, how do you then reflect the changes to the plan when down along the way a constraint comes in? For example, when you planned that about 26 years ago, I'm sure the environmental targets were not as stringent. Yeah. So how does that plan reflect changes, constraints along the way?
Yeah, so what I don't want the people to think is that all the projects were defined 26 years ago, 25 years ago. So what it did was it set out the strategic direction for the network. Where are the key transport corridors, where were the link corridors, and which then needed to develop. That allowed the political process of political decision making as to which individual projects were going to be prioritised, and then it also allowed you the flexibility to then react to things that happened. And I think there's a huge challenge at the minute. We've basically had a national experiment through COVID of us all working from home, and that has spooked the likes of those projects as to what is the next version of that. How can we develop the road network or the transport network in a way that actually facilitates what was being told to us as going to be a completely different way of operation. So things like that you do call into question even the strategic approach, where you do need to sit down, as I said, and have that flexibility to say something absolutely fundamental has changed and therefore we need to revisit that plan. But it may well be a confirmation that actually the plan is right and that we're going to continue, albeit with the environmental or the other constraints that you talk about.
Thank you very much. James?
Yeah, I think what you said around planning and what you said there is kind of integral to it. So I think we need to take a step back and there's a sort of a phrase, think slow, act fast. I think if we spend more time in the planning phase, in the pre-planning phase, we talk about DCOs, talk about legal challenges, and we're involved in a few of those that have delayed and pushed back projects. But But I think the more we can do at a pre-planning stage, early on, and I think involving the supply chain, so we talk about ECI, I think RIS has gone so far, ECI has gone so far in making massive improvements. There's a bit to do. I think the 10-year infrastructure plan, the incoming role of DISTA will continue to provide incremental improvements, but I think that pre-planning piece, that stakeholder engagement, that political buy-in, so that when we look to deliver a project, what is it we're trying to achieve? And making sure that we don't lose sight of what we're trying to achieve. You said around COVID and things fundamentally changed. Does the outcome of what we're trying to achieve, is it still relevant? And the more we do at the pre-planning stage, one, the less money we spend, because it's a lot less money to make a decision on a bit of paper than it is once we've spent a few £100 billion building something and it changes. So I think there's a lot around that planning stage and ensuring that we know what it is we're trying to deliver and why we want to deliver it. That then gives a certainty to the supply chain because you bring the supply chain in an early stage and you get a clear understanding of what we're trying to do. And it may mean that projects do take longer to deliver, but if the supply chain know that we're not going to start something for 5 years because we're going to spend 5 years pre-planning it and getting it right rather than 2 and then having a full storm that says, okay, we're out to procurement, we're going to start now. Actually, we're not going to start now because of a number of things. We would accept that because then we can plan our resources around the fact that something isn't going to happen for 5 or 6 years, but we're involved in the process. So I think for me it's around that pre-planning, stakeholder engagement, and the more we can do to satisfy environmental requirements, legal requirements at an early stage, I think it gives us a great chance of being successful when it comes to that act fast, deliver stage.
Thank you very much. Laura, we're having a question earlier regarding your work with AtkinsRéalis. Now, you mentioned data and social value. How can we harness this better to deliver the outcomes we require? Now, bearing in mind, as James just mentioned, planning. Now, in the 25 years of my career, I've been hearing planning, and if after 25 years we're still saying planning, then something is wrong along the line. So from your perspective, as a supply organization, what's your take on this? And is there anything data can do to help us get this right?
I believe so, absolutely. You know, it's how we use the data, how we collate the data. But equally, just going back to what James was saying, it's understanding those objectives. What are the outcomes we're wanting to achieve? And I think so often we end up adrift from those, and that's where the planning stage kind of falls down. So it's understanding what we want to achieve, what the key outcomes are, what data we've got available, what tools we've got available, how we can implement those. Making sure the quality is right, the integrity is right as well, that's fundamentally critical with this. But equally with social value as well, understanding, you know, local authorities, what their legacies look like, what they're wanting to achieve, how we can build that in along the way. And I think a lot of it is about that planning and understanding. I know you say we've been saying it for a long time, but for me a lot of this comes down to basics. It's nothing sort of whiz bang and amazing. It's about how we apply the basics consistently all the time. And certainly again from a design experience of my own, some of that's around just be really clear on what a project wants to achieve, what the milestones are, and how we're going to drive those. But being even clearer, so a really great example I've seen of efficiency is understanding design decision hierarchy. An example of that would be in foundations. Understanding a contractor's preference on foundation design mitigates so much time in technical queries, pausing design, saves so much money and time for people in delivery. So, you know, quite a diverse way of looking at efficiency, but you know, brings a lot together.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think to build on that point around that whole sort of feasibility, design, deliver, we should be, and I think we are, certainly in the road sector with alliancing, we're becoming braver and we should be becoming more trusting of that process. So get the contractor involved early with the designer, look at procuring around more sort of alliance-based design and build, and not have them as separate entities. So I think the more, again, that we can do to understand the buildability of a design, the better, the more we can sort of integrate that design, build, client function, the more we can incentivise that alliancing approach, I think the better we can get those incremental gains and those efficiencies during the delivery. I think it's a valid point.
Thank you very much. Ben, being private sector driven, I'm very keen to understand what your view is on government policy changes. Now in the UK in the last few years, there's been a lot of changes in government, and therefore some changes in policy along the road. Now, bearing in mind you're private sector driven, how do you reflect this change in product delivery and ensure that clients still get value?
Yeah, it's a major aspect of what we do, and it does drive investment decisions. And I think just to build on Elliot's point earlier around planning policy, I mean that's a really classic example for us, and it's something that we're really heartened by what we are starting to see with the new government. I think there's been some good steps in addressing some of the challenges Elliot set out around judicial reviews to JRs and judicial reviews to DCOs, etc. So I think that planning piece is really important, and I don't think it can be overestimated, if I'm honest, because some examples from the private sector in our industry, we are competing on a global scale for investment into the UK. So we've got live examples right now of projects which are not getting the investment because of delays to DCO. We have a DCO that's going through judicial review, which is holding up £200 million of investment in a new project. So really live examples of impacts to, therefore, our supply chain partners around pipeline certainty. So I feel James's pain absolutely from that sort of that supply chain perspective, and I think from our perspective as a private sector client organisation, we're really keen to further develop in the direction that James set out around alliancing and becoming much more sort of a partnership model. We have a challenge specifically within our sector that we don't have the luxury, if I'm honest, of a sort of reasonably stable multi-billion-year pipeline that you have a chance of having some long-term visibility on. We are very peaky because it needs to be dynamic and respond to commercial demand. But that's not to say we can't do more in that space. I think, again, just from a sort of an ABP perspective, we've done a lot of work partnering with our professional supply chain and developing some really good partnerships. There's certainly much more we can do with our contractor supply chain and working out. We're relatively immature in terms of our contracting model still, from my perspective, and looking at the opportunities around alliancing forms of contract, at least, which would not completely remove the challenges that we've got around projects moving to the right, because the reality is that is still going to happen. But I think from my perspective, it's about how we make sure we're communicating this, minimising the surprises to the supply chain and giving as much advanced visibility as possible. And that just means working closer together, from my perspective.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Elliot, I'm keen to hear your view on that. And I'll put you on the spot now as a major client in industry. From a client perspective, how can the supply chain be more proactive?
Well, could I maybe pick up a couple of key points, a couple of the early points, and I think sort of weave it in. So I was sort of reflecting your point on data and plans and sort of certain. I think it's really, I think the nature of what our plans in the future and providing that clarity is probably different to what it was sort of 30 years ago, when, you know, probably what you were basically kind of creating a forward plan, and that was all about, here's the stuff we're going to build, and here's the sort of improvement. And I think the interesting thing about sort of the way that's evolving is it is increasingly about, well, actually, what's the service you provide and how do you do that? So, for example, when I think about data, I'm really excited over the next sort of 5 years about how we are going to provide better data to our customers, but also ingest sort of data and use data in a much kind of better, sort of more holistic way to enable us to operate the network sort of better. Again, how are we going to drive some of those environmental sort of changes that we were talking about? And then I also think actually kind of in our future planning, starting to really think about some of those big renewals, you know, so some of those big, you know, kind of bridges, etc., that are going to need, you know, some tender loving care. That sort of thing is going to need sort of 10, 15, 20-year sort of plans. So I kind of reflect that as a client, as an operator, actually the nature of the plans that we are, you know, kind of I think having to produce and think about are probably changing different. So I think as as a supply chain, it's kind of recognising that. And I think it's sort of building a bit of agility sort of into the model. You know, as we said, actually, it's everyone's dream across many industries to have, you know, I've got total clarity in the next sort of 15, 20 years, but it doesn't happen in any industry. And actually, I think, as you say, we are sort of quite blessed in a lot of infrastructure, in that lots of organisations do plan on sort of 5-year sort of plus cycles. So I think the kind of question and challenge I would have for sort of industry is just recognise, I think, that where we're going, there does need to be that little bit more agility, and also kind of recognising that it's not just going to be about the sort of traditional big infrastructure, you know, big new infrastructure, but it's also about how do we improve what we've got and use all the tools at our disposal to sort of deliver a better service and deliver in a way that kind of recognises the needs of, you know, the environment, society, etc.
Thank you very much. So we'll come to questions in a minute or two. I'm happy if we get quite a lot of engagement from the audience. I'm sure people are itching to ask questions. But if I just ask one more question to David, and feel free to chip in where necessary. Now, how, as an industry, do we respond to the challenges of delivery, bearing in mind the need to meet our climate targets?
Yeah, and that's something we're grappling with at the minute. In one of the previous keynote addresses, that we're talking about how we haven't even agreed a baseline of counting carbon. So I think it's recognising that we are on a journey and being open to new ideas and being receptive to new ways of thinking in terms of actually working out what actually the answer is. I see in the future that we are going to have a situation where we're saying, here is the economic cost, here is the environmental cost, and here is the carbon cost. And then the decision maker is going to have to look across those in order to determine what actually is the best way forward. And I'm not sure that once we've worked out the very well refined processes in terms of calculating BCRs to 15 decimal places, we're very good at assessing environmental impact because we've been challenged repeatedly through the courts. The carbon piece, I think, is an interesting one, and that's not just something for government to sit in a dark in a room and decide this is how we do it. It genuinely has to be a partnership approach with the industry in order to arrive at that right answer.
And I'm conscious we're going to be talking about that later on in the speech from Mark and John. But how do you respond to that, James?
So I think 2 points. So first, on the agility piece, I think you're absolutely spot on. I think if we look at roads, yes, things do start, things do move. But if you look at across industry and across infrastructure, there are massive pipelines of work, whether it's in water, whether it's in nuclear, whether it's in rail, whether it's in roads. And I think there is a responsibility on us as a supply chain to have that agility and to reskill and multi-skill. So chatting to a colleague earlier around our rail business and how we're looking to temporarily second or redeploy people from the rail sector to the water sector. So within a big organisation like ours, we have the ability to do that. So I think you need to continue to put the pressure on us to do that, so that we don't just come with a begging bowl, so that we've got all these people, we don't know what to do with them. I think there is a responsibility on us to multi-skill and be agile, absolutely right. I think in terms of the carbon side of things, I guess that's sort of multifaceted. There is the reduction of fossil fuels in vehicles. So it's how do we innovate, how do we work with strategic partners, how do we look at new types of fuel, how do we decarbonise the movement of earthworks, for example, which is massive, and it is a big carbon burner because of the amount of diesel that we put in these big machines that do that. So there's the fleet side of things. I think there's a lot within the design. So can we design out the need in the first place? Can we look at modern methods of construction? Can we look at carbon embodiment? How do we look at decarbonisation, the construction in the first place? Do we need to do something? It goes back to that point of what is it we're trying to achieve? Do we need to build a new road? And if we do need to build a new road, how can we be a bit more innovative in selecting the materials we use and getting those through various sort of scopes and DRMB and that kind of things? How do we plan at an early stage to look at the materials we're using in the first place, to use modern methods of construction to build things, and do we need to do it in the first place? So I think it is a big challenge. I think it's a challenge that industry is reacting to. We're doing a lot of work with our fleet suppliers, with our material suppliers, looking at off-site manufacture, all those kind of things within major projects to reduce that carbon footprint of, one, getting stuff to site, and then two, building stuff on site. But I think we need to come together as the whole client, designer, builder to really push forward on that. It's not an easy task, but it is something that is developing, and it needs to develop quick if we're going to hit these 2030, 2040, 2050 targets.
Thank you very much. Laura.
Yeah, so again, picking up on those couple of points with James there, absolutely. I think the agility and diversifying across the multiple industries and markets that we have is a real opportunity for us to learn lessons and to get better at sharing those lessons across industry. So I see that as a fantastic opportunity. Whilst there is challenge there, it is an opportunity for us to learn and do better. And yeah, absolutely, with the design, working with contractors, do we need to design everything that we're proposing? Can things be designed out? I think there's also an angle of recognising that sometimes we do need to invest in the design and build for the future longevity, particularly when we look at climate resilience and pieces like that. And sometimes that does require that thought and investment of thinking, 15, 20, 30 years down the line, where that will pay back dividends, particularly when we're seeing so much climate change at the moment as well.
Thank you very much, Laura. Ben?
So I think, from my perspective, just a couple of things. I think a shout out to the Construction Leadership Council, the 5 climate commitments and the work that they've done there. I think that's a really helpful framework. I haven't yet got ABP. I'm going to be working to get ABP into that now. National Highways are and other client organisations are. I think that's a really helpful sort of framework. And one thing that, again, to be completely open, what I think I struggle with and my team struggle with a little bit is where do we put our focus? Because there's a huge amount that we could do in this space, and having some clarity and better guidance around, we know, biodiversity net gain, BNG, there's carbon, there's social value, there's habitats regulations assessment, there's EIA, there's you could basically spend your whole life doing this stuff, and we are on a process of working out how we sort of frame that, and there's some good stuff by Major Projects Association looking at how to sort of putting together some frameworks for that sort of stuff, but it's all sort of emerging, and if there was a way of having a bit more of a coherent sort of framework for structuring the prioritisation within that space, I think would be really helpful for a client organisation wanting to know where best to put their limited energy investment for the biggest bang for your buck, basically.
Thank you. And before we go to the audience, lastly from Elliot and you.
Yeah, and I was talking with a colleague from industry last night about the carbon challenge particularly, and for me it's partly, we need to not underestimate the challenge going forward, but I think we should also be quite proud about where we've come from and what we've done over the last few years. So I reflect RIS2, which we agreed, only 5 years ago. And to be honest, when we agreed that, we came, carbon wasn't really a thing. 2050 hadn't been signed into law, Carbon Budget 6 wasn't there. And the reason we developed our sort of net zero highways plan was because that environment changed really, really quickly. And then I reflect, crikey, actually, we've come a long way, actually, in 5 years. So there's big challenges and sort of big uncertainties, but certainly, what we're seeing is there is a lot of opportunity. So things like Lower Thames Crossing, we've defined as a low-carbon pathfinder, and they're taking huge amounts of carbon out of their design. So I think there's real, you can see kind of that there are real opportunities. I think the important thing is for us to not underestimate the challenge and continue that at pace, but I think we should also actually shout about and be quite proud about, the level of change I think that's happening across the industry as well, because I think there's some really good stuff going on.
Excellent conversations. Thank you very much to the panel for those round of questions. I see a hand straight up here and another hand straight there. So if we bring the mic to this gentleman at the front first, and after that I'll come to you as well as a second person. So Mike, if you just introduce yourself, and I think your questions probably will go to anybody in the panel, but if there's anybody specific you want to channel it to, by all means.
Thank you. So it's Ben Folser from KPMG. Elliot's looking worried. I'm not going to ask a difficult question. It's sort of a two-pronged question. The first of which is, if you roll back to 2017-18, looking at productivity, there was a big sort of government initiative called Project Speed, which looked at how to try to improve agility and productivity, and there were 5 sort of key recommendations, 2 of which you've talked about today. Simplify planning and consenting, and the second was around long-term pipeline. The other 3 were about approving business cases early in principle. Second was around structuring the gateway, so you've got joint governance and decision making. The third was around early release of funds for land acquisition. So my first question is, are you seeing any of that? Is there any progress towards those sort of other 3 items? And then the second part of the question is, we've talked a lot about the macro, but about the micro productivity in projects. What more can be done there? So I'll let you choose which bits of that you answer.
Who wants to go first?
So I think in terms of the micro around productivity in project delivery, once we're on the ground, there's a lot that we need to look at around one. So whatever we do, we've got to continue to do it safely. And I think the point I was going to make earlier, didn't make it. Within roads, within RIS 1 and RIS 2, I think we've become more and more safe, both physically and psychologically safe in terms of delivering road projects, which we should be proud of, because it is a great thing, and within the business we strive to have AFRs and zeros across the board, and we're getting closer. So I think there's two, whatever we do, we've got to do it safely, and I think then whatever we do to improve, to be more efficient and more productive, we need to then look at things like improving technologies, taking people out of the process in the first place. So can we automate things? So can we automate plant movements? Can we take people away from that? Can we be more efficient? Can we use drones? Can we use technology to map out? Can we use digital twins to look at how we're building things before we build it? So there's a lot around technology. I think there's a lot around improvements in how we plan works, so that we're not moving unstructured around a site. There's a lot around how we, again, look at planning before we start. So things like uncharted utilities. So there's technology in place now where we can get better at understanding what's in the ground before we start digging, etc. So I think there's a lot around technology on the micro side of things. There's a lot around how we program to deliver our works, and there's a lot around, I think, working collaboratively as an end-to-end process around ensuring that when we say we're going to do something, have we thought of everything that could go wrong before we get there to do that, so that when we turn up with a crane to lift something, it's ready to go, and we haven't forgot something. So I think there's a lot around. It's great trying to push the human to do more, but we need to do that safely. But I think it starts before that. It's around the use of technology. It's around the planning phase. It's around getting an efficient program in place.
Yeah, I mean, Project Speed was, I would say, an interesting experience. And the reality is, there was a lot of, I think, kind of good thinking and good ideas in that. There probably was a sense of, it became a bit of a victim of some of the political uncertainty afterwards. I think there's a real opportunity with the establishment of NISTA, though, because I think, the kind of one of the roles of government and NISTA should be about creating that better enabling environment for projects. And I think there is quite a focus there. So, as we were saying, I do think kind of the work on planning is good. I think there is an appetite to look at, again, what's that interaction between kind of government and approvals and governance and business cases plus delivery. I'd argue, there can be, if that can focus on creating more capable delivery bodies, it takes out a lot of friction and will enable things to kind of happen quicker. So I think with the re-establishment of NISTA, that's the time to take a look at it.
Thank you very much for that. We've got another question from a gentleman there.
Hello there, this is Chris Walker, Managing Director of BLS Communications. I just wanted to ask you all a question on some analysis. Sam Dimitrou at Britain Remade analysed 104 projects in 11 countries and found it's 23% more expensive to build roads in Britain than France, 17% more expensive than Canada, and 13% more expensive than Italy. I wondered what everyone's thoughts were on how we can reduce the cost of building roads in the UK, and to pick up James's point on pre-planning, how important pre-planning is to kind of reducing costs, and do we have any good examples in the UK or abroad where more pre-planning has helped to reduce costs and deliver better outcomes?
I'll go straight to James on this one, and I'll come to it as well.
Yeah, so I guess the example that resonates, because I was reading about it recently, so if you look at the pre-planning, if you look at the last high-speed, bit contentious, but the high-speed railway in France, they spent, it was 18 years in the planning, consultation, stakeholder engagement, and 4 years building. When you turn that around within this country, I think we spent 8 years planning, possibly around 15, 16 years building when we finish. So again, I don't want to get too contentious, but I think the pre-planning is key to delivery ultimately. Yeah. So why is it more expensive to build roads in the UK?
So Elliot is itching to come in.
So I think that Britain remade folks do some really interesting analysis. I mean, fundamentally, if you look at France, Canada, they're big, so there's a lot less stuff to wiggle your road through, and that's fundamentally true. I think from a roads perspective, that massively also impacts on rail and others. So being a small, densely populated island, does create cost. And I think that's a fundamental. The question is then, are there additional costs that we are kind of adding to that sort of ourselves? And that's where the whole back tunnel debate and those sorts of things. I think it is a kind of fair question and challenge, and it's good that we're having the debate around things like planning and kind of the amount of kind of mitigations and add-ons almost that infrastructure has to kind of make. So I think that's really important. But fundamentally, we are quite a difficult kind of place to build big new infrastructure, and so that will always create some cost.
David, sorry.
Yeah, so I agree. Scale is one issue. It's interesting that some of the discussions that I've had with our previous minister, we've just had a change of minister, but the previous John O'Dowd, in and around his desire as a minister to move projects forward, and the frustration that he feels with some of the challenges that others have experienced as well. But equally, in that discussion, his desire to make sure that he doesn't become a dictator and overrule, so there's a balance to be struck in that. Yeah. I think certainly in the UK and on these islands, the pendulum has swung too far, that we allow that debate, and the threshold for challenge of projects is too low. I think it should be raised. I think it should be more difficult, that you need to have a more substantive challenge to a project to allow, particularly infrastructure of significant national significance, there needs to be an easier route to market and actually the construction on those, but without overruling or being unduly blind to the needs of or the impacts on individual communities. So there's something there that I think would make us more effective and more efficient and help the productivity of projects.
Thank you very much. I'm allowing this panel to run slightly longer because we seem to be having a very good debate here. So I'll take another question from.
My name is Yuli. I'm the Chief Engineer of Tensor, and I'm also an elected member of the IC Council. So my first point was going to be about NISTA, which you covered, and I think everybody's hopeful, and hopefully it will bridge the gap that we're trying to do. Yes, but it's great. It's starting, so I think, yes, we can only be hopeful. But for the answer, how to make things, I mean, it's already been covered, but I just want to give an example. Early stage involvement key for the pre-planning, and get it right in the first place. So also with the IC, we've been looking at this role of the design champion. So who's going to be the person at board level of every project. So we don't have to go later on to value engineer the project. It has to be right at the first place. And I have an example from, sorry, for whoever doesn't know what Tensor does, we are the inventor of geogrids and geosynthetics. So we half the size, the thickness of pavements, and we create green bridges. I don't know who said it, you said it, you know, that reduce carbon by 66% when compared with reinforced concrete on piles. So that's a green build as well, but that's not the one you're referring to. So in lower Thames Crossing already, by doing a value engineering in pre-planning, they removed the whole TBM because this person who, I hope he will become a design champion in the future, he looked at the scheme and he also came to Tensor for example, for foundations under an embankment, and the conservative or the standard design is to use piles, but there's so much more than that, and there's a lot of modern techniques, like you say, that need to be considered at pre-planning. So it saves time, it saves costs, it saves energy. Yeah, so pre-planning, early engagement, and design champion, I think, and that will make a big, and NISTA, of course, and that will make a big difference. So hopeful for the future.
Thank you very much. So I'll just take, if there's any one more question before we wrap up this session. All right, it doesn't feel like there's any more. All I can say is thank you very much for that discussion, and it's been very interesting to hear the views across the industry sector. Thank you very much. Can we give a round of applause?